Now, before the Constitution could be officially adopted, there had to have been enough consensus among the states and their state assemblies to ratify. So we have this framework, which is great. It's going to create separation of powers and checks and balances, legislative, judiciary, executive, all that fun stuff, right? Okay, well, we need to actually adopt this and actually sign it into law. So, popular consent among many of the founding fathers was the idea behind the new system. And it was supported by George Washington, and Ben Franklin was a Federalist. And then there were three other guys: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. So James Madison wrote the draft of the Constitution, and he was an ally with Alexander Hamilton. And along with John Jay, they collaborated to write a series of essays deemed the Federalist Papers that basically outlined and explained the reasoning and rationale why the Constitution was important. Alexander Hamilton wrote the majority of the essays. And his rationale was that the United States needed a stronger central figure, but he detailed in ways in which it would not be tyrannical but necessary. Well, there were people who feared that even though the intentions of a central government are very good, there were those who were against the idea of having a constitution. They were deemed as anti-federalists. As a matter of fact, some of the biggest revolutionaries, like Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, believed that, well, if you have a strong central government, you're still going to have the opportunity of tyranny, which is the reason why we fought the war in the first place. And they believe that also, if you have this new central authority figure, you're going to wield more power back to the people who are wealthy. You're going to kind of undo the idea of helping somebody who's a commoner, and you're going to erase individual liberties. Those were the extent that the anti-federalists raised in opposition against the Federalists. So the Federalist Papers were intended to squelch some of the anti-federalist sentiment. Okay? There had to have been something perhaps that could maybe do all of those things. So there is the actual structure of the Constitution itself as largely written by James Madison. In order to placate anti-federalists, there was a Bill of Rights that would be added to the Constitution that would list out, by way of amendments, exactly how the government is not to overstep and become tyrannical. It would detail out freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to right to bear arms, freedom to write of various different things that you see in our modern Constitution in our first 12 amendments. So listing some among them: power trial by jury, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, immunity from arbitrary arrest. Hello, Fifth Amendment. Trial by jury, as I mentioned, and others, of course. Okay. First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third, Fourth, Fifth. You see where I'm going within that. Because now a Bill of Rights would be added, even after the Constitution was approved in the 1787 summer, now 2 years later you would have a Bill of Rights that would firmly placate, well, at least placate enough fears of the anti-federalists to go ahead and move through. You amend the Constitution and you add in the Bill of Rights. Because of the Bill of Rights, you are able to speak freely. You're able to speak your mind. Freedom of the press. You have a right to purchase arms, a right to defend yourself, a right to gather a militia. You have a right so as not to incriminate yourself. I plead the fifth. Okay, that's what that means, okay? You're not going to incriminate yourself. So you have various different things that were added in so as to help understand exactly what the government can and cannot do. Okay? You can be any religion you choose. You don't have to have a religion. Okay? It deems a separation of church and state. So you don't have to have a formal religion, so you don't choose. Okay? So therefore, the intention was to eliminate the idea of the government overstepping its bounds. So you had that initial ratification, and then, of course, you would have the Bill of Rights. But what do we do about the executive? What do we do about this president? Okay? At the time, George Washington wielded the biggest popular stick. Okay? He was a Revolutionary War hero, commander, a very, very influential, landed Virginian, came from as close to American nobility as you could expect at the time. He had as much clout as anybody in the entire country. And as such, you saw a creation of the Electoral College, which would elect our president based upon votes for each individual state. Okay, more on that in a second. George Washington was unanimously voted in as president by essentially the Constitutional Convention, and John Adams was voted as vice president. Nowadays, the president and vice president are voted in on a ticket. They vote together. Back then, after that very first election, whoever won the most votes in the Electoral College would be president, and whoever had the second most would be vice president. So the person who beat you would now be your boss. Great. That would eventually change. Much is also discussed in recent years about the Electoral College. What is the Electoral College and why do we have it? Essentially, every state has a certain number of votes, okay, based upon people in each state. So, California has 55 electoral votes. Texas has like 38, okay? Those are the two most populous states in the country. Wyoming has like 3. Not a whole lot of people live there, okay? The Electoral College exists much the same way that the United States Senate exists in our legislature. If there is no such thing as the Electoral College, then a popular vote would just be a form of democracy that completely eliminates the little guy. So we have an Electoral College that gives smaller states a voice, and who from a federal instance is going to have power over them. Okay? So you have folks who vote in Wyoming. They would never get a say if they didn't have at least some sort of electoral vote. So in American presidential elections, the winner of the presidency is not the winner of the popular vote. It's whoever has the most electoral votes. So think about it this way. State of Illinois. You have Chicago, and then you have the rest of the state. Chicago basically runs the entire state of Illinois. Yeah, I know the capital is elsewhere, but as Chicago goes, so does the rest of the state. Most of the rest of the state is not in line with Chicago. The state of Illinois is largely agrarian, rural. They grow crops, wheat, corn, you name it. It's an agricultural state. But because Chicago is such a very big city that's very powerful, as Chicago goes, so does the rest of the state. You ask folks from Illinois, elsewhere outside of Chicago, how they feel about that, and there's a little bit of resentment sometimes. Because Chicago wields that big stick and they feel dominated by it. Okay. That's one of the reasons why, in a different scheme, you have the Electoral College. So, every state, based upon population, receives a certain amount of votes. You have electors from every state. Based upon the amount of votes for a certain candidate in that state, they place their vote for that. So, if in the 2016 election, Donald Trump wins the state of Texas by popular vote, the Texas state electors would vote and offer all 38 votes to the Electoral College in favor of Donald Trump. In 2016, Hillary Clinton carried the state of California. All 55 electors cast their vote for California for Hillary Clinton. That's how the Electoral College vote. That's how it works. Wyoming, whichever candidate wins, gets their 3 votes. Not every state has only 3, and some just have as few. The Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana, some of the states along those lines that are lesser populated, they're not going to have much of a say. Okay? You don't want Texas and California and New York, Florida calling every single shot. But there are arguments against the Electoral College, and largely it's from people who deem the idea that America didn't vote in Donald Trump. They didn't vote in XYZ president. They voted for this guy. They voted for Hillary. They voted for Biden. Okay. That's not how our founding fathers saw things. So for those who make arguments against the Electoral College, you're also making an argument for how our legislature is set up. The idea of there being a balance, having a Senate where every state has 2 senators, having a House of Representatives where you acknowledge the larger population, you're in effect creating that sort of balance that the Founding Fathers had in mind in our original framework. The Electoral College follows that ideology. If you deem the Electoral College as unnecessary, then it's likely that you probably have a problem with the equal attempt at a balance within our legislature. Food for thought. Otherwise, though, George Washington becomes our first president. John Adams is our second president. You organize the executive branch, and America now has a Constitution and a Bill of Rights.